So let's dive into JavaScript and some basic programming concepts. Try not to get too overwhelmed by this. This is mostly meant to be conceptual in this video to give you some background, and then we'll do exercises when you come to the workshop in May. But JavaScript is a scripting language, and it can be used in HTML files. You don't need any special plugins or libraries or programs. The browser can actually interpret JavaScript. And it's what can make your programs interactive. It can make your websites and your web pages more interactive. So all you have to do is include the script element either in your own file or in its own document. If it's in its own document, you obviously have to reference that document, include a link to it in your page. But in all our examples, I will be including a script element, and then all the scripting will be happening right within the HTML page. So the rest of these things here should be somewhat familiar to you in terms of what we've already covered. So it's important to have just a general sense of some programming concepts before we begin programming. And one of the most basic elements of programming is the variable, and it's used to store data. And some of you may have had some programming experience, so I apologize if any of this is a review for you. But in this case, I am storing a string with my name in it in the variable name. And then that way throughout the program, if I want to refer to my name, I can have that be a variable, and then that variable can change depending on somebody having filled out a form or some other type of an input into this program. That was a string because it is letters and it's encapsulated in those quotation marks. But we have different kinds of data types. We can have numbers, and those are often integers or floats, whether they have decimal points or not. And they do not have to be encapsulated in strings. And then we have Boolean, and the Booleans are either true or false. So sometimes we're just testing if something is existing or true, or if it's false, and then we'll have different outcomes for that. The concept of concatenation sounds like a big long word, but it really is just combining variable strings and numbers to be able to make a new variable. So if we take name, for example, and we want to concatenate first name with last name and put a space in between it, we would do that in the following manner, where we'd say name equals, and then have the variable that maybe we grabbed from a form. They're filling out a form where they're ordering something on Amazon, and they have to fill out first name. And then we want to put a space in it and last name, and maybe we want to return some sort of a message to them that greets them with their proper first and last name with the proper space in between it. So that will concatenate it and store that in the name variable. There are often methods associated with programming languages. Two methods that come to mind quickly that are often used with JavaScript are the length method and the substring method. The length method just gives you the number of characters in the variable. So maybe I just want to get the number of characters in a password. Maybe somebody has a form they fill in and they're asked to put their password, create a new password, and quite often it's like it has to be the certain minimum numbers. And so we'd want to be able to grab that and find out, well, this password that you just put in, how many characters does it have in it? And then maybe do some sort of testing on that. So if I put the word password, which is a terrible password, into a form as password, the length would be 8. If I put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is also a terrible password, into the password, the length would be 6 because it has 6 characters. Substring is another one, and we'll do some exercises in the workshop with substring, but that tells me a portion of a name. And so sometimes programs will cut off parts of your name if it's trying to make a username. Like my username maybe would be Sin Roy if that was how the program wanted the username to be. So it would take the name that I had created and it would maybe want to get the first so many characters of it. Or in this case, take a name or some sort of a word and only give me the substring of the first 8 characters for it. So the substring is the method, and then it has these arguments 0, 8 that tells it to start at the beginning. 0 is the beginning of the string, and then give me the next 8 characters associated with it. So that way if you put in something that's too long and then the program only needs 8 characters, it can ask for it that way. If statements are a common logical test in programs. It's basically something that says if something is true, then do this. otherwise do something else. So in this case, we're trying to say if the password length, and I have the PW standing for the variable that is holding the password in it, if that is greater than 8, then we'll create some sort of a message that says password accepted. If not, that's what the else stands for, the message would be password rejected. Now, we haven't done anything with this message, but now that variable of message exists, and we can actually return that back to the user in some way, and we'll talk about that as well. Often there are loops that are used, and loops really start getting us toward data practices. How can we do things over and over again? How can we look through a series of data and either print it out or make some assessments of it? In this case, I'm just showing you a loop that happens 10 times. So this is a for loop. There are other kinds of loops, but I tend to always use for loops. And there are 3 parts or 3 arguments of this for loop. The first part is I equals 0. The I is the iterator. I could have named that anything I wanted, but you'll quite often see it as I, as a single letter. It's just easy, and it stands for iterator. And then each element of the for loop is separated by the semicolon. And then we have the condition that it evaluates. So as long as I is less than 10, it will do this 10 times. And it will start at 0 because we told it to, I equals 0. And then the I++ just means to add 1 to I every time I go through the loop. It really means I equals I plus 1. So every time I go through it, add 1 to I. So first time around it's 0. Then it goes through the loop again. Second time around it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when it gets to 10, it'll stop. And, as soon as it's no longer less than 10, then the loop knows to stop. So I have this message here that it's going to just say repeating this 10 times. It's going to do that 10 times. We would have other things, obviously, in the loop that would tell it what to do with that message or how to print it. And a function is a way to store a series of instructions to be referenced later in the program. So you define a function by giving it a name, and you just use the keyword function and give the name to it. Sometimes functions don't have anything passed into it, any sort of a parameter, and sometimes they do. So in this case, I am creating a function that's just supposed to say hello, and I'm going to pass into it something when I call that function, because right now we're just defining the steps. We're just creating the instructions, but the program doesn't get executed until somebody calls that program to be executed. So I'm saying here that the message will be hello plus whatever somebody passes into that function, whatever the name that somebody passes into that function. And notice here that I have actually included a space between the O in hello and the closing quotation mark, and that allows there to be a space between hello and the name, as opposed to having to concatenate an empty space. Either one of those works, but you have to think about that. Quite often, you'll run your program and it's like, oh, why did my name get crushed over onto the word ahead of it, onto the greeting ahead of it, and you have to figure out how to get the space in there. So those are the instructions, and then this is the actual execution of it. Somewhere in the program, it would call function hello with the text Cindy, and then that way, everywhere that A is in this program, it's going to be replaced by Cindy. So it would come here and say, hello, Cindy. It's that simple. Obviously, functions can get much more complicated than this, but that is generally the concept behind a function. Now we have a couple of concepts that let you store data in a program, and sometimes you want to do that because you're grabbing data from people. Sometimes you want to do that because you have a data set. So the first thing is an array. And these can be called different things in different programs, but they're basically lists of elements. So in this case, I have 3 bands listed here, Coldplay, U2, and Foo Fighters. They're all strings. They're all separated by commas. And they are included in square brackets. And each element of that array has an index number assigned to it, starting with 0. So Coldplay would be 0, U2 1, Foo Fighters 2. And so first band equal band 0. That's how I would access the first band in that array, and it would put it in the first band variable. And then an object is a little bit more of a complex way of storing information in a program. You'll see here I have bands, but instead of just having the names of bands, I have several different properties. I have name and country. And so in this one, I have name Coldplay, name U2, name Foo Fighters, and then I have country England, Ireland, and United States. And just notice that the values are all enclosed in quotation marks. Each one is enclosed, each grouping is enclosed in these curly braces, and then each one is separated by a comma. The entire object of bands, the list of bands, is actually an array. So this is an array of objects, and you'll see that it is opened and closed with a square brace. So don't get too confused about that. If I wanted to get the name of the first band and put it into a variable, I would get the name of the object, and the name of the value goes after the dot, but within the name of the object it says, well, find whichever one. The first one is at index number 0, so we access it with an index number and a property. And then the last method is the JavaScript method getElementById. And this is the one that we will work on most in class because it's really the most powerful one that lets us change something in the document object model. We will be talking about manipulating the DOM. And that lets us take something that's in HTML that has an ID associated with it and putting something else in it. And so we will start with a hello world program, which a lot of programmers start with hello world when they're learning a program. It just shows you how to say hello world. It's a little bit of a nerdy thing. You could actually have it say anything you wanted, but hello world is always the first program everybody does. So we can change what is known as the property of inner HTML of an element with the ID of message in our HTML. And then we can grab a value from a form element and put that into a variable by indicating the ID name of the element that's on the HTML page. That's something probably in a form, grabbing the value and putting that in a variable. These are very, very powerful features in making interactive presentations. So let's look at a few examples. I have a few different programs here for you to look at. I have created this one, and let's make this a little bit bigger for you to see. I have created this program that basically has a paragraph in it with an ID of MSG. And all the script is doing is changing the inner HTML of MSG to the text hello world. So we're never actually going to see this part that says this will change. The script just opens up and it changes the inner HTML. This is not necessarily something you'd actually do, but it shows you how this getElementById and inner HTML work on changing something that is in the document object model, the DOM. So let's bring up that program. And you can see it doesn't say this will change. It says hello world. And so that is the JavaScript at work manipulating the DOM. So that one's pretty simple. The second one I have here actually has a form associated with it where it grabs someone's name, and we have created a submit button. I think I did not talk about buttons when we were talking about forms, but sometimes you want a submit button. Sometimes you don't need a submit button, but in this case we want the user to be able to hit a submit button, and at that point this message will change. And so the elements that are in the script are the introduction to what needs to be changed, what needs to happen, what kind of an event needs to happen for this generic function to kick in. So it's saying if my form, which is what I've named my form up here, is submitted, then do this. So it says take whatever is in my name, that's what this is up here, grab the value of it and put it in name. And then to change the inner HTML of message, we want it to say hello, that's just the text, and notice the space here, plus name. So it's going to grab the name from the form and then put it into this message. Now, this little element here, return false, is necessary whenever you have a submit button, because submit buttons have the characteristic of refreshing a page, and we really just want the DOM to change. So anytime you use a submit button, you have to say return false. So let's look at this one in the code. I'll just change the name of the file I have here. And if I type in my name and submit, it says, hello, Cindy. That's simple, nice and interactive. A third example we have just has the same exact thing except with a drop down. So instead of having a text element here, I have a drop down that has 3 cars in it from our example previously. And here it's going to take on change of the form. So notice I don't have on submit. I just want this to change. And that's a good event to use when you have a drop down by itself, because you don't need to drop down and submit. You just want it to drop down and change. So I have it where it's grabbing the value from my car, putting it in car, and then I have the message inner HTML changing to you drive a, and then whatever kind of car. So let's try that one in the browser. This one is test.js3. And if I just change this to a different car, it's going to give me a different message. Okay, so another cool little bit of interactivity. Now, back to the presentation, I'm going to talk about something called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. And this will get a little more complex, but we'll have some more experience with looking at this in the workshop. This is a way to store and organize data in a text format, and you often see things in JSON format. And we can use a loop to access it and return it to the DOM, and sometimes we'll use a condition to filter it. So this is data that I had received previously from the City of Austin data portal that had some information about incidents for the fire department. And so it would have like an incident number and a month and a latitude and longitude. And latitude and longitude are obviously very good for mapping. But in this case, I'm just going to show you how to work with the data to just to include it into the DOM, to be able to repeat it in the DOM. So again, this is an object. We've got an array of objects, each of them open and closed with the curly braces. And then each item in the array has a property and a value. And if it's text, the values have to be enclosed in quotation marks. Each one of these items is separated by a comma. So we just have 3 incidents here, and we have them all in January right now. So I have some examples here that look at the use of JSON. So I have here these items where it's the same data set where it says data equals, and it has all these incident numbers and months. And what this program does is it just goes through and writes that to the DOM in the message that we have. And I started with an empty message this time. I'm using, instead of equals here, I'm using plus equals because I want it to append it every time it goes through the loop. And it's going to go through the loop the number of items we have in the data array. And we have 3 items in the data array. I know it looks like a lot of stuff, but we have one, we have a second object here, and we have a third. So as soon as it runs out of items in the array, it will stop. And it's going to append it to message with this plus equals every time it goes through. So this should get our incident number and our lat and our long. It will get nothing else unless we add that to it. And then each time it goes through the loop, it will end with a break. That's a HTML break, so it'll put it on a different line. So let us try example number 4. And it just read it for me. So there's no interaction with the user. It just read exactly what was in that data set. So that brings us to the next thing that we would want to do with 5 is we probably want to have some way of only including a certain type of data. So I changed one of the months here to be February so that we'd have 2 in January and 2 in February. And by adding an if statement to our for loop, it will go through and say if the month is equal to February, print it out. That means the Januaries won't get printed out. So if we look at that quickly, this is only the Februaries. And then the very last example that I have, maybe you want the user to be able to choose which month. And so we've got January and February here. We also even have the beginning one to say pick a month to get started. And it's the exact same thing, but instead of the one we had before, it's creating a my month ID for whichever the selection is. And it's grabbing that value and putting it into a month variable. And so then it's saying if the month in the data set is equal to this variable month, then do it. So if we pick January, it'll only give us January. If we pick February, it'll only pick February. And I will show you that right now with number 6. We pick a month. Those are the January items. Those are the February items, only one. So I know this seems a little bit confusing, but I hope you can see how powerful it is. I've done some pretty easy examples to break down the basics of using variables, working with if statements, working with loops, working with arrays, and working with objects, so you can start understanding how people, when they work with code, use JavaScript object notation. A couple final things here. Programming uses comments in different types of programs in different ways. And so when you're using JavaScript, there are single line comments. So just like we had HTML comments, there are comments in JavaScript, and they're frequently used to give instructions. So a single line comment is just 2 slashes, and a multi-line comment, if you need to comment out multi-lines, opens with a slash and an asterisk, and it closes with the asterisk slash. So not to add to any potential confusion, but I do want to broach the topic of jQuery. jQuery is a JavaScript library, and it often will simplify coding or provide some advanced functionality. And all you have to do is create a link to that script, and you can often find the link, the script, somewhere on a public site like the Google API site that I have here. And you just have to make sure you have the JS file for the jQuery included in your page, and then you'll have access to all of jQuery. You can also download the jQuery library and put a local link to it in the script. And so here's just a little example of jQuery. It's indicated with a $, and you can see how it shortens things. Because before we had to say document get element by ID, my form, we just sort of replaced that with the $, and indicate it's an ID because of the hashtag. We do have to open all jQuery with this statement because it basically says, hey browser, some jQuery is coming, get ready. It has the same kind of an event, but you just have to say submit instead of on submit. And then when we're grabbing the value from a form, we are only grabbing that value from with val instead of value, and putting that in the first name variable. And then here we are manipulating the ID of message, again, not using document get element by ID, and not using the whole inner HTML. We're just saying HTML, and then we tell it that we want it to change it to the first name, and we can still use return false. So again, it shortens things, and there are other functionalities within jQuery. I can show you how that would work with this document here. I have the form where we submitted a name through the form with a text input. And I've got this area that says this will change. And then down here is my jQuery, basically the same as what I just showed you. It will grab my name from the form, it'll put it in first name, and then we'll give first name to MSG in the DOM. And so that will work here. I have it up. If I put in Cindy in here and hit submit, it changes that to Cindy. I can actually put anything I want in there. I can concatenate it as we had done previously. So I know that's a lot, and I want to recommend and forward you to my Code Actually site, because under the basics, if you still need some more with the basics, you can find more information here. And then I have a whole section on JavaScript and jQuery that goes into a lot more detail with videos and lots of code samples. So you can figure out which one of these areas you want to spend more time on and learn more about, and then you'll have some more resources to be able to assist you. So that's it for this week. I know it was a lot. Keep in mind that these concepts of programming are things that we cover in multiple classes. So to be able to cover this in one module, 1 week, or in a few hours in a workshop is really impossible. So for the most part, just look at this as a foundation in giving you some background, and then giving you access to some resources for future training. I think the most important thing when you're teaching any kind of programming is modeling problem-solving skills. That's going to be the most important thing that a student would take with them, knowing that the first time you do a program, it is not going to work. That is always the case, and the job of a programmer is to solve those problems. And so it's a wonderful skill to be able to have, to not get frustrated, and to know, to have the confidence that you will be able to find an answer. So to be able to model those skills, to show students the processes that one would go through to be able to figure out why a program's not working or how to get a particular feature that you wanted, is going to be the best skill coming out of a programming course. So take a look at the assignments. I have a few things for you. I have an assignment for you to modify the script of the test.css.html file to make it your own file. And then I also have the JavaScript files for you to look at, the ones that I went over in this exercise. And they're all in a GitHub. I'll have a link to that for you that you can download those files. The JavaScript files I want you to keep in mind with the exercises that I did here. These are very plain files to only demonstrate the functionality of JavaScript. You would obviously be integrating this functionality into a well-designed website or web page and not have it looking as plain as it is. But I wanted to break out the functionality so you could identify how that worked, and then those types of things would be used on an HTML page where a user could actually engage with them. I also have a short quiz for you to take, and there will be a link at the end of the module with the address for you to be able to take this quiz, and it will just cover some basic concepts of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So good luck with the materials this week, and I look forward to seeing what you create.